I want to welcome everybody to today's lecture, which takes place in the context of our lecture series on mathematical philosophy, and which is in honor of the centenary of Bertrand Russell's visit to Peking University from 1920 to 1921. My name is Julius Schoner, and I'm very excited and honored to introduce today's speaker, Alan Hájek. Many of you who are watching will know him already and will have read many of his publications. But for those of you who don't know him, he is a professor at the Australian National University. He works on a wide range of topics such as the foundations of probability, decision theory, epistemology, the philosophy of science, and metaphysics. He has written countless vastly influential articles and many books which have heavily influenced how we now standardly think about probabilities, about beliefs, about rational decision-making, and more. And apart from being famous for his views, he's known for his engaging style and the clarity of his argumentation. And just to name a few of his articles, he's the author of Interpretations of Probability, What Are Degrees of Belief, and importantly for today, of the article Most Counterfactuals Are False, which is an important predecessor to today's talk, in which he will tell us why most counterfactuals are still false. And I shall say that there's going to be an hour-long talk, and after that, we're going to have 30 minutes of question and answer period. So without further ado, I ask Alan to give his talk.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Julius. Look, I'm delighted to be speaking to you. My only regret is that I can't be there in person with you today in Beijing, but I'm thrilled to speak to you nonetheless. Also, thanks very much to Yang Jing for just setting this up and for all of the help he's given me. All right, most counterfactuals are false. I've long argued for a kind of counterfactual skepticism. I like to imagine an extremely long transcript of all the counterfactuals that have ever been uttered and that ever will be uttered in human history. And I say most of them are false. Now, this is the most polarizing talk and project of mine. Some people think that I've lost my philosophical marbles, that I've just gone crazy, that this thesis that most counterfactuals are false is just crazy. Others think I'm clearly right, and I've given arguments that show that this is the case. Sociological observation. The former, the ones who think I'm crazy, they tend to be philosophers of language and mind, who think that principles of charity or humanity must be operative. I must be misunderstanding how semantics works when I attribute such widespread falsehood to competent speakers. The latter, the ones who think that I'm right, well, they tend to be more philosophers of science and naturalistically inclined metaphysicians who agree with me that such widespread falsehood is just what one gets when one lives in a chancy world and science teaches us that ours is. All right, so I'll soon recap my main arguments for this widespread falsehood. But common sense recoils. Ordinary speakers judge many counterfactuals that they utter to be true, and recurring examples in the literature, which I judge to be false, include, if the cup were released, it would fall, or let it be this glass, okay? And I see a nice cup over there. I promise you, I will not let go of this glass, or I will try my best not to. But if I were to let go of it, it would fall, right? Wrong, I say. Or there's a famous example, Sophie sadly did not go to the parade, but she would have loved to see Pedro dance. Pedro, this baseball player, danced in the parade. Sadly, she missed it. If Sophie had gone to the parade, she would have seen Pedro dance. That's supposed to be true. I say it's false. And so it goes. Counterfactuals play an important role in science, social science, and in philosophy. Now, especially those of you who are immersed in philosophy, you see counterfactuals all over the place. They figure in influential philosophical analyses of knowledge, personal identity, rational decision, perception, free action, moral responsibility, confirmation, causation, laws of nature, explanation, dispositions, truth in fiction. I could go on, and so could most of you. So my counterfactual skepticism has been regarded as a radical position. Edgington says that counterfactual skepticism would have a disastrous effect on the use we make of these conditionals. I'm somewhat flattered that my view could have such enormous consequences. Well, a number of philosophers have defended our judgments against counterfactual skepticism, offering accounts that uphold the truth of ordinary counterfactuals. I'll start with some general considerations about counterfactuals, and then I'll rehearse my main arguments for counterfactual skepticism. I don't want to assume that you know them, so it would be useful just to repeat the main ones. Now, most of the main replies to counterfactual skepticism assume some version of the usual Stalnaker-Lewis similarity analysis of counterfactuals. A counterfactual is true just in case the most similar, or as we say, the closest antecedent worlds are consequent worlds. And just to make sure we're all on the same page, a counterfactual, if P were the case, Q would be the case, P is the antecedent, Q is the consequent, okay? Now, I beg to differ with similarity analyses. I don't like these similarity accounts. I will offer some general objections to them based on general considerations about counterfactuals. And then I'll look more closely at various accounts that uphold the truth of ordinary counterfactuals. Some appeal to David Lewis's notion of quasi-miracles. Don't worry, I'll tell you what that means. Robbie Williams appeals to typicality. Ori Stefansson to counterfacts. Moritz Schulz to an arbitrary selection semantics. Karen Lewis to contextually sensitive relevance. Jonathan Bennett to most of the closest antecedent worlds. Lightgeb to high conditional chance. Okay. Each account tries to get at something important about counterfactuals, and I say good on them. I admire what they're doing, but I will critically examine them because I think in the end they're wrong. I'll offer a sketch of my own positive account of counterfactuals, which I argue has various advantages. It will follow from it that most counterfactuals are false, giving me another argument for that thesis. Okay, now falsehood gets a bad rap. By that I mean falsehood has a bad reputation. I say a lot of good communication, good science, good philosophy gets done with falsehoods. And indeed I say that of some of the very philosophical positions that I will criticize today. So even if you think I've lost my philosophical marbles, that I've gone crazy, I hope my objections to some of the leading accounts of counterfactuals out there and my own positive view will be of interest to you. Okay, so that concludes the introduction. And let me just quickly check in with you. You're hearing me okay? This is going okay? Good, thank you for the thumbs up. I'll keep going. All right, let me now give you some general considerations about counterfactuals. Counterfactuals typically involve taking some event in our history, envisioning some modification of it, and then stating how things would evolve from that point onwards. Now, I say this feeling like it should be common sense, and yet I think it's very radical. It's a complete departure from the orthodoxy about counterfactuals. But let me say what I mean. Counterfactuals have us imagine something about how the modification propagates thereafter. So I say such counterfactuals are hypothetical predictions. So let's take one of the classic examples. If Oswald had not killed Kennedy, someone else would have killed him. So I say, imagine going back to a time shortly before that fateful moment in history, 12:30, 22nd of November, 1963, when Oswald's killing Kennedy or not still could have gone either way. Each had a positive chance. Suppose that it then goes the not killing way. Now, from this initial condition, predict what will happen thereafter. What's the truth value of someone else will kill him? I say it's the same as that of the counterfactual. According to the counterfactual, things will play out thereafter in such a way that Kennedy is killed by someone else. The will of this hypothetical prediction corresponds to our would. And then more generally, consider a counterfactual of the form, if P had been the case, Q would have been the case. This is a hypothetical prediction. Imagine an agent at a time just before the truth value of P was settled. The world could have gone either way with respect to P. Suppose the agent has full knowledge of the state of the world at that time. Put yourself in her shoes. What should she predict will happen? By the way, I think this is a good mantra for life. Put yourself in the shoes of other people. It's a good rule to live by. But this is how you should evaluate a counterfactual. Put yourself in her shoes. It could go two ways, the P way or the not P way. She predicts what follows in each case. Her claim of what will happen if it goes the P way corresponds to our claim of what would have happened if they had gone the P way. All right. Now, actually, I don't know if you'll be able to easily speak to me given our Zoom arrangement, but I'm wondering whether what I'm about to say is a feature of English specifically, or whether it generalizes, and I'd be very interested whether it's true, in Chinese, in Mandarin, but let me say it about English, because that I do understand. So we can simply see this hypothetical prediction of the distinctive past-future morphology of such counterfactuals. So think of the slightly strange way in which we go subjunctive. We say Oswald had not killed, and that projects us to a moment in the past. Okay, I'm using the past tense, had not killed. And we want to speak of what will happen relative to that moment. Since it's past, we must use the past tense of will, which is would. Okay, so you get the had not killed would combination in English. Now, Justin Koo cites the linguist Iatridou's explanation of this morphology. The extra layer of past tense on a subjunctive conditional carries a modal distancing rather than temporal distancing, as past tense usually does effect. It signals that the speaker is talking about worlds potentially different from those compatible with what is presupposed. That's what Iatridou says. Now, to me, this sounds very, very odd. Why should modal distancing be achieved by the past tense? So she's saying this past tense sends us to another possible world. And I say, no, it sends us to the past. A much more natural explanation is to take the past tense at face value. It projects us to an earlier time, saying what was true at that time. Okay, maybe this won't work, but I'm wondering if you can tell me quickly, or perhaps Q&A, if that's better, whether there's a similar phenomenon in, say, Mandarin. Is it better if I just keep talking? Yeah, okay, I'll keep talking. Let's hold that for Q&A. Maybe you can enlighten me about subjunctives in different languages. But in English, I think it's quite easy.
Now, if there's a person asking it, then I'll let you know.
Cool, that's a good answer, thanks. Okay, so think of two ways in which we cannot, even in principle, derive what will happen given a specification of initial conditions and the laws of nature. The initial conditions are too unspecific, or the laws are chancy. Either way, one cannot uniquely predict the future, and this brings me to my main arguments for counterfactual skepticism. So I have two corresponding arguments for counterfactual skepticism. One's from chance, and one is from unspecific antecedents. So let's do the chancy consequence first. Stare in the face of chance. And I want you to think as vividly as you can about what a chancy process is like. So let me give you one. Here is a coin. Can you see it? There's the coin. Nice Australian coin. I will never toss it. In fact, I'll put it away. Gone. If the Chancy coin had been tossed, it would have landed heads. Not tails, heads. Okay, I say that's false. Let's do another one, okay? Now suppose the coin is heavily biased towards heads, but there's still some chance of landing tails. If the Chancy coin had been tossed, it would have landed heads. No, I'm joking. That's false, I say. Why heads? Cournot is famous for his principle that any improbable event will not happen. I think that Cournot's principle is clearly false, however low we set the bar for improbable. For example, it's refuted every time a radium atom decays at the exact moment that it in fact does. Probability 0, according to our physics, that it will decay exactly at this particular time, and yet it does. Okay? Contra Cournot's principle. I say a counterfactual version of the principle is even less plausible. Any improbable event would not happen. Think of counterfactuals about a lottery that is never played. Let it have a zillion tickets, many tickets. Never played. If the lottery were played, ticket number 1 would lose, according to Cournot's principle, because it's so improbable that the ticket would win. If the
Alan,
lottery, yep.
I promised you I would tell you there's a person telling me that there's no grammatical distinction between indicative and subjunctive in Mandarin.
Interesting. In Q&A, we might follow up on that because I actually want to collapse. I want to make them unified, indicatives and counterfactuals. Whereas in the literature, a lot of people make them very different. In fact, some people think that counterfactuals have a similarity semantics. Indicatives don't have truth values at all. You know, very different. And I say that is so strange. And I'm delighted to hear that in Mandarin, the distinction is collapsed. It's a good point for discussion. Okay.
I'll keep track of it.
No, that's nice. So the lottery, if the lottery were played, ticket number 1 would not win. If the lottery were played, ticket number 2 would not win. It's so improbable. All the way up to ticket number zillion would not win. Hang on. It follows from that every ticket would not win. But there would be a winning ticket. Contradiction. So do you see the sort of trouble you can get into with Cournot's principle? The mere fact that something is very improbable doesn't mean that it would not happen. Some ticket would win. There would be a winning ticket. Science tells us that we live in a chancy world. Lotteries, in a broad sense, abound, even macroscopic ones that we take to be deterministic. There's a tiny chance that the released cup would be lifted by a sudden updraft or vaporize or quantum tunnel to China. Now, that joke's not quite as funny when you're actually in China, I guess, but from here, that would be very strange. All right, that would be extremely unlikely. I say a counterfactual cannot second guess the resolution of a chance process. In a slogan, chance undermines would. And for those of you who like symbols, I've symbolized it. Ch, that's the chance function at the relevant time. The chance of not C given A is positive, entails not. The box arrow is the counterfactual. So not A would C. All right? Chance undermines would. Now, in case you think I've lost my marbles, I'm happy to allow the truth of various probabilistically qualified counterfactuals. For example, if the cup or the glass were released, it would probably fall. That's true. Indeed, it's largely thanks to such true counterfactuals that we can get by just fine with the false ones that we utter, which are closely related. My skepticism is benign. All right. That argument for skepticism focused on the consequence. The next one focuses on the antecedents. unspecific antecedents. So let's do it. Now I don't even need a chancy world. Even if our world is deterministic, it's still false that if the cup had been released, it would fall. The antecedent is unspecific. The cup was released somehow or other. How? It does not specify the exact initial conditions of the cup's release. This macrostate is compatible with many microstates that deterministically evolve to anomalous microstates. For example, ones that correspond to the cup vaporizing rather than falling. Think of Maxwell's demon in statistical mechanics. The devil is in the details. But we don't need high-powered physics to make the point. Counterfactuals that have unspecific antecedents and comparatively specific consequence are false. Here's a famous one. If Bizet and Verdi had been compatriots, they would have both been French. Okay, Bizet was French, Bizet was French, Verdi was Italian. If they'd been compatriots, they would have been both French, not Italian. I say false. Why French? Unspecific antecedent. If they'd been compatriots somehow or other, specific consequence. French. Okay. I don't have a son. If I had a son, he would have an even number of hairs on his head. Not odd, even. What? I want to say false. Unspecific antecedent, son somehow or other, specific consequence. Consequent. Even, not odd. All right, now, and so it goes. I think that most counterfactuals are like these, just less obviously so. If Sophie had attended the parade, somehow or other, she would have seen Pedro dance, specifically. False, I say. She could have attended the parade and got stuck behind a tall person. A counterfactual cannot second guess the resolution of an unspecific antecedent. In a slogan, unspecificity undermines would. Okay, that argument focused on antecedents. The next focuses on the relationship between antecedent and consequent, brought about either by chancy consequence or unspecific antecedents, or both. Actually, the typical case is both. Might nots. And again, you might like to think about whether you have a parallel in, say, Mandarin. Both chancy consequence and unspecific antecedents give rise to might not counterfactuals. And might not counterfactuals conflict with their would counterparts. So let's try it. If the cup were released, it might not fall, but it would fall if it were released. Ouch. If Sophie had attended the parade, she might not have seen Pedro dance, but she would have seen Pedro dance if she'd attended the parade. No, stop, ow. Okay, now the pain that I feel and that I hope you feel, I'm sorry to inflict it on you, is that of inconsistency, I say. I think that might not is incompatible with would, and many agree, and let's symbolize that. The diamond arrow is the might counterfactual. If A were the case, it might be that not C entails not A would C. In a slogan, might not undermines would. The might not counterfactuals are typically true, so the would counterfactuals are typically false. Sophie might not have seen Pedro dance. She might have got stuck behind a tall person. So it's false that she would have seen Pedro dance. And I'm done with my arguments. So you have now heard many years of my philosophical life compressed into a few minutes. Well, countering counterfactual skepticism. I've long argued for counterfactual skepticism, but I felt I was not doing justice to some of the main replies, and I will try to do so today. Most of them assume a similarity semantics for counterfactuals, either a Stolnaker-Lewis account with some extra detail on what matters to similarity, or a tweak, some small revision to that sort of account. Now, setting aside intramural disputes between Stolnaker and Lewis, some technical finessing, these accounts have roughly the form. If it were that A, it would be that C is true, if and only if all the most similar A worlds are C worlds. Okay? You go to the closest A worlds. You check, are they all C? C worlds? If yes, then the counterfactual is true. If not, not. Well, they say philosophers never agree. Well, except perhaps on the claim that they never agree. But to an unusual extent, philosophers do agree that counterfactuals have truth conditions that involve similarity of possible worlds. Just read the literature. People keep on assuming similarity accounts. I disagree for many reasons. That's another paper. Sadly, I wish we could spend so much more time together. Given my confined time, I have to move on. But just let me briefly convey to you why I don't like similarity accounts, begging to differ with similarity accounts or counterfactuals. Okay, remember I gave you my general picture of counterfactuals. They're hypothetical predictions. I never spoke of similar worlds, let alone most similar worlds. I say that a typical counterfactual does not involve other worlds, but rather a different time in our world when the truth of the antecedent was not settled. Again, put yourself in the shoes of someone just before Oswald shot Kennedy. You're guided by what you take the probabilities of various subsequent scenarios to be. You're not guided by considerations of similarity of our world to some other world. Now, step back to our vantage point. Why should we be guided by considerations of similarity of worlds? Instead, we should be guided by the probabilities. And I'll say more about what these probabilities are later. So, counterfactuals are hypothetical predictions. Predictions involve probabilities rather than similarity relations to other worlds. And I do not need to take a stand on just what similarity relation is supposed to be like. Appealing to any such relation would be puzzling to me, but most of the replies to counterfactual skepticism do. And now just let me say a little bit about what is this similarity that people keep appealing to. It's not commonsensical. Kit Fine, for those of you who know the literature, showed us that. It's not David Lewis's semi-technical ordering. So Lewis said, here's what matters to similarity for counterfactuals. First, avoid big miracles. Then, maximize the spatiotemporal region of perfect match, a particular fact. Then, avoid small miracles. So he had this priority system. Well, I say it's odd how it intersperses between two avoid miracles priorities, which I would have said should be continuous with each other, something completely different, namely the stuff about spatiotemporal perfect match. For example, where do we place avoid medium-sized miracles? It's odd that the similarity relation Lewis appeals to is quite different from one that might subserve predictions about the future. One wonders why and how we adopted a convention to use counterfactuals in this way. That, for example, they seem to be out of touch with good old induction. And remember, I say it's all about predicting the future. Anyway. And here's a little exercise for you. The following comes out true according to his ordering. I didn't scratch my finger yesterday, but if I'd scratched my finger yesterday, I would have done so at midnight, at the last possible moment in the day. Well, I don't know about you. That doesn't sound true to me. What? Why midnight? Okay, so I find if you actually go out on a limb and say something about the similarity ordering like Lewis did, and congratulations, good on him for trying, there'll be counterexamples like I just gave, the midnight counterfactual. But maybe you don't go and say much. You just say, oh, similarity, I won't tell you how it works. It's context dependent, it's vague, it's whatever it needs to be so that the truth values come out. Well, I call that Harry Potter's wand. Harry Potter had a wand that could do all of these magic things. I won't tell you much about how the wand works. All right. Now I'm going to consider these people who counter my skeptical position. Some attempts to save us from counterfactual skepticism are explicitly targeted at my arguments. Some are not, at least originally, but they could easily be deployed against them. So look, there are a lot of replies to counterfactual skepticism out there, and I'm trying to organize this for you to give it a bit of structure. So here's my taxonomy. You could keep the usual similarity semantics for counterfactuals. So this is just good old Lewis, and you just add some detail about what matters to similarity. So this will be quasi-miracles, this will be typicality, this will be counterfacts, and these are the corresponding authors on the handout. You can tweak the similarity semantics for counterfactuals. It's still basically a similarity semantics, you just slightly amend it. Arbitrary selection semantics, contextualism, similarity and relevance, near miss. And don't worry, I'll tell you all about these soon. Or, I say better, you could just give up on similarity semantics. This is the high conditional chance view, and we'll talk about that. But I disagree with all of them. I say that these accounts water down the truth conditions for counterfactuals. They lower the bar for truth, lower than they should. They make it too easy for a counterfactual to come out true. And as a result, several of them will violate inference patterns that I regard as valid. Chance undermines would. Remember, I talked about that. Might not undermines would. I talked about that. Modus ponens. And agglomeration. Agglomeration, it's on the handout. A would C1, A would C2 entails A would C1 and C2. Actually, I used agglomeration in my lottery example, if you remember that. All right. And then I'll present my own view, which is a maximally high conditional chance view. All right. So let's look at these replies to counterfactual skepticism. The first one is inspired by David Lewis, and this involves so-called quasi-miracles. Now, here's the view. Lewis was not specifically answering counterfactual skepticism, rather an indeterministic version of Kit Fine's famous example, if Nixon had pressed the button, there would have been a Holocaust. The button is hooked up to a nuclear bomb. And Lewis was concerned that there could be perfect reconvergence to actual history. The details don't matter. But let me go on to what Lewis said is the reply. A quasi-miracle could erase all traces of Nixon pressing the button. It would be a big cover-up. And Lewis says a quasi-miracle, although it's entirely lawful, nevertheless detracts from similarity. The quasi-miracle would be such a remarkable coincidence that it would be quite unlike the goings-on we take to be typical of our world. The chance outcomes seem to conspire to produce a pattern. Isn't this great for the Nixon example, right? Cover-up, conspiracy, Watergate. Well, now how's this meant to answer counterfactual skepticism? Well, the might not counterfactuals are false, as they involve more distant worlds than the woulds. So worlds where cups, at which the cup does not fall, are less similar. So you don't have to look at them. You don't have to worry that the cup might not fall. Problems. Well, I find the notion of a quasi-miracle problematically unclear, given how much theoretical weight Lewis wants to place on it. He doesn't actually give a definition of a quasi-miracle. He just gives a special case involving the Nixon example. He says seems to conspire. Well, that's obviously metaphorical. It's not like, you know, objects in nature conspire. Soon we'll try to finesse it. It's unclear that appealing to quasi-miracles gets the desired truth values. The cup flying upwards, remember that was one of my weird possibilities. That's not a coincidence. It's not like it seems to conspire to produce a pattern. It doesn't even seem relevant. Or Sophie getting stuck behind a tall person is definitely not remarkable. That happens at all parades. People get stuck behind tall people all the time. Remarkable is not a scientific notion to the extent that it goes beyond low chance, and it needs to go beyond low chance. Indeed, penalizing remarkable outcomes for similarity may even be anti-scientific. I mean, quantum mechanics and relativity, they're remarkable to us, I guess, but so what? In the so-called EPR correlations in quantum mechanics, particles seem to conspire, so what? Remarkable sounds anthropocentric. It's centered on the way we think. And also there's a problem with agglomeration. If I were to release the cup, there would be no remarkable coincidences anywhere in the universe. That comes out to be an analytic truth. We just agglomerate many local counterfactuals. If I were to release the cup, there would be no remarkable coincidence here. There'd be none over there. There would be none at Alpha Centauri, and so on. Now, agglomerate, there would be no remarkable coincidence anywhere in the universe. Wow, how remarkable. I don't even think it's true, but in any case, it's not analytically true. The absence of quasi-miracles locally gives rise to a quasi-miracle globally. Okay, now, in the interests of time, can I ask you to fast forward downwards to the section Williams typicality? So on the handout, for those of you who have it, you can read, I have some more arguments against quasi-miracles. In the interests of time and for the Q&A, let's move on to the next response to counterfactual skepticism. This is Robbie Williams' typicality. So Lewis said that quasi-miracles are quite unlike the goings-on we take to be typical of our world. And Robbie Williams runs with this idea. The view, Williams replaces the notion of quasi-miracles with that of atypicality. Each possible sequence of fair coin tosses is equally probable, but most sequences are typical, while a sufficiently long sequence of heads, say, is atypical. Now, seems to conspire to produce a pattern, Lewis said. That sounds like non-random, okay? Williams, we can identify the required notion of typicality with the mathematical property of a set of outcomes being random. And randomness, in turn, can be given a rigorous and objective characterization. My concerns about unclarity and anthropocentrism are dispelled. The notion has good scientific credentials. There's a mathematical theory of randomness. And then finally, atypical non-random patterns detract from similarity. Worlds in which they occur are less similar than worlds in which they do not. So they're the quasi-miracles, right? They're the things where things seem to conspire. So you banish them, they're further away when you look at similarity of worlds. Well, how's this meant to answer counterfactual skepticism as before, but more rigorously? All right. Now, problems. Randomness is a property of a set of outcomes. Indeed, an infinite set in Williams's discussion, but counterfactuals often involve single outcomes. If I were with you in Beijing, we would go out, actually not to lunch, we'd go out to dinner, wouldn't we, given your time difference. And it's a regret of mine that we can't go out to dinner together, okay? But look, this is not some infinite set of outcomes. This is one case, you know, today, tonight, we would go out to dinner. So randomness doesn't even apply to this single case. And there's another bad Cournot-like principle. Nothing atypical will happen. Well, sometimes the atypical happens in the actual world. Sometimes, you know, you toss a coin many times and it lands many heads in a row, just by chance, maybe 20 heads in a row. That's atypical. It looks non-random. It looks like the heads are conspiring. They're not. It's just an unlikely event that happens. And the account violates modus ponens. By typicality, if I were to toss the coin 20 times, it would not land heads every time. But suppose I do toss the coin 20 times. In fact, it lands heads every time. The weird thing happened. And again, agglomeration. If I were to release the cup, there would be no atypical outcomes anywhere in the universe. That comes out to be an analytic truth. You keep on agglomerating. There'd be nothing atypical here, nor at Alpha Centauri. Agglomerate, nothing atypical in the whole universe. Wow, how weird that is. Okay, gambler's fallacy. You could read it on the handout if you have time later. I should move on. We're up to Stefansson Counterfactism. Well, if Oswald hadn't killed Kennedy, then Kennedy would have lived to the age of 81 years, 269 days, 17 hours, 9 minutes, and 41 seconds. There you go. We'll never play the billion ticket lottery. If a billion ticket lottery were played, then ticket number 17 would win. Now, these are doubtless not the correct numbers, but there are correct numbers to replace them, and they render these statements true, right? Wrong, no, I'm joking. Again, I don't believe that, and nor should you, or so I'll argue. But there's an increasingly influential view inspired by Stalnaker and advocated by Hawthorne, Bradley, Moss, Stefansson, which is committed to there being such numbers. According to the view, there are true counterfactuals like these. It's just a matter of getting the numbers right. Now, we don't know them, of course. It's a kind of epistemicism. For those of you who know Timothy Williamson on vagueness, it's like that. And the view goes back to the medieval Molinists, especially Suarez. They believed in God having so-called middle knowledge. God is omniscient, and he doesn't just know everything that actually happens. He also knows how all counterfactuals would turn out. They focused especially on free choices. For any particular situation that you could find yourself in, God knows what you would do is the fact of the matter. And now just generalize that. There's always a fact of the matter, and God knows it. Well, let's call them modern Molinists. Drop the commitment to God's knowledge, but they keep the commitment to there always being a fact of the matter for any antecedent, for exactly how things would turn out. And Hawthorne's version of this is that there's always a unique closest world where the antecedent's true, and it just determines the truth of the counterfactual. You know, if at the nearest world my coin landed heads, well, that's how the coin would have landed, full stop. Well, what I call counterfactism is the conjunction of these two theses. Counterfactual plenitude. For any antecedent A, there is a world WI, such that A would WI is true. Okay, if A were the case, this entire world would be realized. If I were to release the glass, a whole world would be the case, and God knows it. Primitive counterfacts realism. There exist primitive modal facts that serve as truth makers for counterfactual claims. They're baked into reality, these modal facts. All right, now how is this meant to answer counterfactual skepticism? Chanciness and unspecificity associated with counterfactuals do not suffice to show that they're false. Like the Chancy coin, well, if at the nearest world the coin would land heads, that's the fact of the matter of the counterfactual. Never mind that's chancy, that's just how it would land, and God knows it. Well, problems. Look, there are concerns about appeals to modal primitives more generally. Let's maybe fast forward through this bullet point to the next one. But modal primitives are just dangerous in general. And the appeal to counterfacts seems to open the door to another kind of skepticism. We don't know the truth values of most of the counterfactuals that we utter. In particular, we don't know when they're true. You know, if I were to let go of the glass, it would fall. Well, we just don't know, because depends what this primitive modal fact is, which we can't read off the non-modal facts. So I find that more disturbing than my skepticism. Mine's benign, remember. Counterfactism is ontologically profligate. It multiplies entities. Following Lewis, call a doctrine qualitatively parsimonious if it keeps down the number of fundamentally different kinds of entity. Quantitatively parsimonious if it keeps down the number of instances of the kind it posits. Counterfactism is not parsimonious on the first count. It adds an extra kind of entity, this primitive counterfact. And it's profligate on the second. It has lots and lots of these things multiplied. It introduces a new kind of entity. Counterfacts populates the world with many instances. Indeed, it seems that no world, however simple, could be fully captured parsimoniously once we countenance primitive counterfacts. Not even a world with just one elementary particle doing nothing, not even an entirely empty world, but there's still a plethora of counterfactuals that are true at such worlds. And according to counterfactism, their truth makers are primitives. A complete true theory of these worlds then would have to be extraordinarily complicated. And this seems wrong to me. Okay, could we please fast forward through the next bit? It's there on the handout. Now again, in the interest of time, I think I will fast forward through Schultz, and it's there on the handout if you need Schultz in the future. Let's go down to Karen Lewis. There, perfect. Let me just quickly tell you what I skipped over. You won't need to read it on the handout, but Schultz says just one antecedent world is just arbitrarily selected. And I find that mysterious in much the same way that I found counterfacts mysterious. You know, how is it that this one world of the many gets selected? As it might be, the coin lands heads. That gets selected arbitrarily. I don't get it. And in any case, we could never know it. And I find that a worse skepticism than mine. Mine is benign, remember? All right, let us continue. We will now talk about Karen Lewis. Now, when I've given versions of this talk for a long time, people keep on coming up with a version of the following reply, and probably some of you are itching to stop me and say, Alan, stop all this nonsense about counterfactual skepticism. Don't you know that counterfactuals are context dependent? Well, so let's look at one of the best accounts of that. Karen Lewis, Contextualism, Appealing to Similarity and Relevance. This is her paper, Elusive Counterfactuals, and some of you might get the subtle reference to a paper by David Lewis called Elusive Knowledge. And in a way, what she does is similar to what David does in the paper on knowledge. So here is Karen's view. For all contexts C, P, box arrow, Q is true in C if and only if all the closest P worlds are Q worlds. So far, that's familiar. Where closeness is a function of both similarity and relevance. And that's the extra part that Karen Lewis adds. By the way, I teach my graduate students a little trick. You know that there's something wrong with an analysis if the variables on the two sides don't line up. Look on the left-hand side, there's a C, okay? True in C. The right-hand side, there's no C. So something's gone a little bit wrong there. We better add a C so that the two sides line up. Okay, now she says the relevant possibilities are the ones that fulfill the current conversational purpose. Well, how is this meant to answer counterfactual skepticism? The undermining might not worlds are not contextually relevant in normal contexts, though they may become so by drawing our attention to them. And so they're not among the closest antecedent worlds. But let's do it. If I were to release the glass, it would fall. Look, in a normal context, it's just not relevant to worry about weird cases where the the glass flies away, you know, sudden updraft or quantum tunnels to China. Now, I can come along and change the context, and I can draw your attention. I could say, well, gee, the glass might quantum tunnel to China. I've changed the context, okay? But in the original normal context, you know, speaking on the street, these weird possibilities were not relevant. So speaking on the street, the counterfactual was just true. I could make it go false by doing something weird to the context. But most counterfactuals are not in such context. They're normally in an ordinary street context, and they're true. Well, why don't I like this? Again, I think a counterfactual is making hypothetical predictions, and nobody thinks that what will happen should be sensitive to your current conversational purpose. You know, what will happen doesn't care about what you find salient or what your interests are. Just what will happen. Well, what is relevance? Karen says the relevant possibilities are the ones that fulfill the current conversational purpose. Here's another technique I teach my graduate students. Whenever you see the word "the," see it in neon lights, because it presupposes that there's exactly one. Okay? Well, two ways to deny that. There could be none, or there could be more than one. What if there's no conversation and hence no conversational purpose? For example, counterfactuals that are privately thought or said. Okay, in the privacy of your own study. We don't want relevance to be tied too closely to conversation. Or what if there's more than one purpose? You know, maybe you're in a bar and you're talking to a quantum physicist. What's the purpose? Well, when she offers her explanation of how might counterfactuals can induce context shifts, she says, in uttering a might counterfactual, the speaker raises the conversational stakes. She takes lower probability events to be relevant. That's my emphasis. She takes. Now that sounds too subjective to me. It sounds like the more ignorant or unimaginative you are, the easier it is for your counterfactuals to come out true. Chance doesn't stop being chancy just because you stop thinking about it, or it is irrelevant to your purposes. All right, now finally, she spoke of the function of similarity and relevance. What's this function? She doesn't tell us, and it would be hard to do so. Harry Potter, right? What are the rules of the game? Well, I suppose better to do that than to actually commit yourself like David Lewis did. Say, here's what matters to similarity. 1, 2, 3, and then out come the counterexamples. Well, okay, as such, it's harder for me to provide counterexamples to Karen's account than to other accounts, but then as well as answering counterfactual skepticism, Karen's account also accommodates it. In fact, I can help myself to her analysis. We just disagree on what's relevant. So here we go. I don't like similarity, I'll leave it out. If A were the case, C would be the case if and only if all the relevant A worlds are C worlds. I just regard more worlds as relevant than she does. You know, the quantum tunneling, the sudden updraft, I say they're relevant. Now, Goodman famously had this problem in Fact, Fiction and Forecast. The truth conditions of counterfactuals depend on the laws and background conditions. These determine the relevant A worlds. How do we specify these without further appealing to counterfactuals? So famous problem laid down by Goodman. I claim to have solved it. I say they're the A worlds with positive chance at a time just before the antecedent. And I'll say more about that shortly. We're starting to get towards the finish line now. Okay, let's go down. Can we fast forward through Bennett? Let's skip Bennett, but let's go to the next one, which is Lightgeb. Lightgeb, high conditional chance. So I like this view better. A would C is true if and only if the chance of C given A is very high. If I were to let go of the glass, it would fall. Why? Well, because the chance of it falling, given that I let go of it, is very high. Okay? Well, there's a lot I like about the view. I like how Leitgeb seeks to give counterfactuals good scientific credentials, objectivity, truth values, unlike Edgington, who also gives a probabilistic account of counterfactuals, but no truth values. And conditional chance plays a central role, not similarity. So my view's similar to his. But his, I don't think he got it quite right. Here are some problems. I think that Leitgeb gives a plausible account of approximate truth of would, a plausible account of truth of would probably, but not of the truth of would. Would probably has a different logic. It violates modus ponens and agglomeration, which I insist on. Would probably violates the incompatibility of would with might not that I find compelling. We could fast forward a bit. Let's go to the next point. Slightly lower, yes. I think that Cournot's principle is clearly false. Don't worry, well, I can take over from there. I think Cournot's principle is clearly false. Sometimes extremely unlikely events just happen. And I don't like the counterfactual version of it anymore. And I also question the metaphysical and semantic significance of the threshold for very high. Like what happens there? Why does that make all the difference to truth and falsehood? So for all these reasons, the bar for very high has to be set at 1. But then far from answering my skepticism, this is music to my ears. Most counterfactuals will not clear the bar. Dilemma. If we set the bar less than 1, we have failures of various logical principles that are sacrosanct or at least highly intuitive. And you've heard me talk about them. Chance undermines would, modus ponens, agglomeration, would might not conflict. If we set the bar at 1, we don't get an answer to my skepticism, quite the contrary. Well, you know which horn I choose. I like the skepticism, and that brings me to my positive view. And so now we're on the home straight. Typical counterfactuals have the following truth conditions. A would C is true if and only if the chance of C given A is 1, where chance is the chance function, so where ch is the chance function at a time just before the truth value of A was settled. And then I can also give you the complementary analysis of the might. So I say that a typical counterfactual does not involve other worlds, but rather a different time in our world. Hence, I think that all talk of similarity of other worlds is misguided here. I can speak of closeness to truth, as I just did for Leitgeb. It's harder to do when you speak of all the relevant worlds. The counterfactual is assertable if and only if the corresponding conditional chance is high. And I claim I solve Goodman's problem. The truth conditions of counterfactuals depend on the laws and background conditions. Now, how do we specify these without further appealing to counterfactuals? Well, my answer is the background conditions are the facts just before the truth of the antecedent was settled. To the extent the laws enter, they do so via the chances. No appeal to similarity, just chances. I claim to get the right logic. Chance undermines would, might not undermines would, modus ponens, agglomeration, and so on. It all fits. But Alan, this leads to counterfactual skepticism. And remember, and now we've come full circle to my opening. Remember the opening concerns about common sense and science and philosophy. And Karen Lewis speaks of the threat of counterfactual skepticism, and the counterfactual skepticism can raise its ugly head. Well, I feel it's a very pretty head. I like counterfactual skepticism. Counterfactual skepticism is not so scary. Falsehood is not such a big deal. We're in the very, very last section. And if we could scroll down to that. Falsehood gets a bad rap. Falsehood, common sense, and scientific reasoning. Okay, remember at the beginning I said the philosophers of language and mind who think that I misunderstand how semantics works when I attribute such widespread falsehood to competent speakers. Well, I reply, competent speakers may be authoritative regarding the meanings of their words and regarding the truth conditions of sentences that they utter, but they're not thereby authoritative about the truth values. That's partly a matter of how the world is, and we may be ignorant or inattentive about that, how the world is. Look, it's no surprise if common sense is wrong. The folk get a lot of stuff wrong. They don't know the science that I appeal to in some of my arguments, quantum mechanics, statistical mechanics. Science often corrects common sense. Think about simultaneity, special relativity, or solidity. And philosophy corrects common sense. Our judgments are notoriously bad regarding related modal notions. Think of probability, like base rate neglect, the conjunction fallacy, the gambler's fallacy. People are bad at probability theory. So why think that our judgments regarding this modality, counterfactuals, are good when we're bad at probability, particularly when they interact so closely? And in fact, I've given you an analysis of just how closely they interact. Falsehood gets a bad rap. It gets it mainly from philosophers, especially philosophers of language. Remember my sociological observation at the beginning? Psychologists are not so troubled by falsehood, and nor should they be. Falsehoods can do a lot of good work in common sense. Gil Harman and Donald Davidson did, I think it's pretty much unknown, maybe the earliest example of experimental philosophy, like years before experimental philosophy was fashionable. They eavesdropped on conversations in bars and cafes, and they just listened to what people said and kept track of how much of what was said was false. And it turned out that most of what people said was false in general, and not just counterfactuals, and for all familiar reasons. You know, people are sometimes joking, sometimes it's hyperbole, sometimes people get facts wrong, sometimes they're misleading, okay? Sometimes it's loose talk. The list goes on. Falsehood is not such a big deal. We can communicate very well in bars and cafes and in philosophy departments. Science, you can do a lot of good science with falsehoods. Newton did. Newtonian mechanics is false. It's nearly true, it's false. Inconsistencies, quantum field theory is inconsistent. That's pretty false. You do good things with it. Idealizations, frictionless planes, ideal gases. Trust me, there are no such things. False, false. It's okay, good theories. Ceteris paribus laws. And in philosophy, look, many important philosophical positions are false. And this is clearest when two or more such positions are incompatible with each other, but they're important nonetheless. And in fact, by my lights, I've discussed several such theories. All of the rival theories to mine, I claim, are false, 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 false. Presumably they think my theory is false. Fine, we can all get on. And I'm glad these theories are out there. You can do a lot of good work with falsehood. It's not as if we must speak the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in order to communicate effectively or to do good science or to do good philosophy. Truth gets a good rap, sometimes too good. Now, I don't want to go all postmodern on you, but truths can be uninformative, unassertable, useless, unnecessarily complicated, misleading, counterproductive, depressing, and so on. Give me a useful falsehood over a useless truth any day. I'm reminded of a few good men. You can't handle the truth. Sometimes speaking the truth is more of a hindrance to effective communication. In fact, sometimes false counterfactuals that we utter will typically be more assertable than the true ones in the neighborhood. So suppose I said to you, if the cup were released, it would probably fall, which I claim is true. It would probably fall. Now that misleadingly conveys that this cup release would be somehow special, like this is a trick cup or something, some magic. No. I would be misleadingly conveying that I have some sort of inside information about this weird cup. No, better just to say the false thing like everyone does. it would fall. And ironically, despite the roles that counterfactuals apparently play in science, some of my main arguments for counterfactual skepticism appeal to science itself. So thanks so much, we're done. Most counterfactuals are still false, and that's okay. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Alan, for your wonderful talk. I think I speak for all of us, thanking you for your thought-provoking talk. We're gonna now have about maybe 25 minutes of Q&A, and I wanna encourage everyone who's not a panelist to write down their questions in the Q&A boxes, and then we'll try to, or Alan will try to answer your questions. And I think it'd be nice if you wrote down the questions in a way that we could actually make sense of them. So sometimes a question, there's just one sentence and it's a bit hard to interpret. It'd be nice to have a question that we can actually fully understand. The first thing that I want to say, since Alan was interested in it, there's a couple of comments on counterfactuals in the Chinese language, but it's, I wonder whether you want to hear these comments. Some of them have quite a bit of Chinese in them. And one person says that there is an if-then distinction in Chinese.
Let me understand. So maybe let's start with that one. Did you say there is no if-then distinction? Was that how you said it?
No, one person says that there is an if-then distinction.
There is.
Another person says, but I think this is hard for me to interpret.
Can I maybe, let's see if this works.
Yeah.
I didn't quite understand it. There is an if-then distinction. What's the distinction? Is it the indicative subjunctive?
Well, I don't see much more. I can read the bubble to you. As a native speaker, I like to say that we have clear distinctions between subjunctions and conjunctions, because in the Chinese language, we have words like if, then, and, which have similar logical functions like they have in English. And we don't have any problem writing papers in analytic philosophy in our native language. Otherwise, we wouldn't even have been able to teach analytic philosophy and philosophical logic in Chinese.
That doesn't quite address one of my questions, which was, do you have the distinction between counterfactuals and indicative conditionals? Do you have that distinction in Chinese? I don't know if anyone can answer that quickly.
Yanjing is writing a response to that.
Thank you.
Yanjing.
Hi, I think we can just call the questioner to clarify the things. So I'm asking Jiang Lu to speak. Jiang Lu, are you still there? Hi.
Wonders of technology.
Sorry, shall I speak
yes, please.
instead of writing?
Yeah, you can speak.
Sorry for my first question, because I didn't formulate it very quickly, very clearly. So sorry, but no. I have done some. I have given some further clarification because I realized that my first answer was not quite clear, and because I heard about this statement before in Germany, people have asked me whether we have some problems expressing this subjunctive mood, and I would say that we express it semantically. We don't have this kind of a grammatical mood like subjunctive mood in the European language. It is not expressed in the conjunctions of words, but we have these semantical tools, and at least in modern Chinese, we have some. I think that they are quite logically equivalent, because we distinguish between 假如 假如 can also be translated as if, but there is another word which is 如果. So it is a little harder to find the dictionary explanations which can distinguish between these two words. But if you put them into the sentence, the distinction will be very clear, because 假如 is counterfactual or hypothetical. So 如果 is rather conditional, and it is more conditional in an indicative way. So then we have another word which is more likely counterfactual, and this is 要是. Maybe it is also hard to find some equivalents in the dictionary, but we have to translate all the words in sentences. Then it becomes very clear. I have mentioned an example, which is 要是他来了，我们就会有一个有趣的客人. I have to write it in Chinese because we have to translate it equivalently into English, and then it will read, if he were here, we would have an interesting guest. So we could say, if Professor Hájek were at Beijing University, then we would have we could talk to him personally and not across the screen. And sorry, that has been a little bit lengthy, but that's what I meant.
That's very good. So yeah. What I got out of that, remember, one of my sort of quick points was how in English, the way we say the subjunctive works very well with, according to my theory, namely you go back in time and you use the past tense, you know, Oswald had done something, and then you need to look forward from there with will, but in the past tense that becomes would. And so, you know, I nearly fell off my chair when I realized this. I thought, my God, this is my theory, and it's right there in the grammar. But what I understood, and thank you for what you just said, is that maybe that Chinese doesn't so nicely conform to my theory. It's not that you sort of move things to the past and then look forward. You use, I guess, a different word altogether.
Yeah, thank you. I understand the purpose. Yeah, it is beautifully done with this wood form, I think. Yeah.
So my theory would be, I would like it even more if it just completely universalized across all languages, that everyone does the same trick of moving back in time and then looking forward. It worked in English, so I started there. But forget, I'm slightly joking because I don't want to take, you know, this idiosyncrasy of English too seriously. But I do take seriously this vision of what counterfactuals involve, right? Going back to the relevant point in time and then making a prediction.
Yeah. I think this is a very inspiring point, actually. Perhaps maybe if I don't know whether I'm allowed to take more time of the other people, but I have an association because, you know, there is also some thoughts about this Occam tree. So the future is open. So they put all the possibilities in the future, but for the past, according to Arthur Price reconstruction, the parts are closed, so it is actually necessary. So we cannot, according to this model of time, there is no way of construction this kind of counterfactuals, but you have to go into the future to find other possibilities.
Excellent. And notice how this again fits with my theory based on chance. That the past is not chancy. This is the view I'm assuming, and this is a standard view about chance. David Lewis holds it. Okay, anything that's true of the past has chance 1 now. Okay, like Oswald did sadly kill Kennedy, so that has chance 1 now because there's no undoing. It's not an open matter anymore. Okay, so but it's the things looking forward that are chancy, and that's where the chances get to be less than 1. And that's how the counterfactuals get to be false.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
That was really inspiring. Yeah.
Thank you, Alan. I think we have lots of other questions, and I think in the name of fairness, maybe we should move on. Thank you again. There's a question coming from Yang Liu. They're asking, why does unspecificity of antecedents undermine instead of justify would?
Okay. So let's take one of my examples, like I don't have a son. If I were to have a son, he would have an even number of hairs, not odd. Okay, so first point, I hope that sounded crazy to you. It sounded, well, false, right? And my diagnosis is you have an unspecific antecedent. You know, I have a son with either even or odd numbers of hairs, because that's how numbers work. But then the consequent just chooses one of them and says, that's the one he would have. He would have even. Actually, I'm glad you've raised this, because this gives me an opportunity to tell you another of my arguments here. It's so little time, so much to talk about. Disjunctive antecedents. Okay, so I want you to consider the following counterfactual. So there you are in China. Let me just choose the example so it'll work for you. If you were in Canberra, where I am, or Baghdad, you would be in Australia. So I'll just say it again. There you are in China. If you were in Canberra or Baghdad, you would be in Australia. I hope you think that sounds false. Why? Because Baghdad's not in Australia, it's in Iraq, right? So what just happened there? I gave you this unspecific antecedent, right? And then I chose one specific realization of it. You know, Canberra is in Australia, so it would have come out true on that realization of the antecedent, but that's not good enough. You know, it was too specific relative to the unspecific disjunctive antecedent. So to try and answer your question, I think the question was why does unspecificity undermine counterfactuals, their truth? It's because you have to basically look at every realization of the antecedent, and it's very hard for the counterfactual to come out true, however it's realized. And then, of course, the way I translate that is in terms of conditional chance. So if there's, you know, some realization of the antecedent that does not lead to the consequent, well, then the chance can't be one. So that's just to say a bit more about that argument, which I had to give too quickly, for why unspecificity undermines counterfactuals. Maybe that's enough for now, because I know there are more questions, but thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you in their name also. There's let me read a question to you by Guanglong Luo about your reliance on quantum mechanics in making some of your arguments. How about the counterfactual, if quantum mechanics were false, then the world would be different? Excellent. Or how about the counterfactual, if the Hájek's Chancy argument were false, then Lewisian counterfactual semantics would be true? Is there any possibility for the Chancy argument there?
Excellent. Okay, so I had noticed how I was cagey. I hedged my bets and I said typical counterfactuals, and that would have been another discussion about what I meant by typical. But if quantum mechanics were false, that's not a typical one. That's my short answer. But why not? If quantum mechanics were false, that's not just a counterfactual. It's a so-called counter-legal, right? Because I think you're really assuming the laws of nature are different from what they actually are. the actual world is a quantum mechanical lawful world. If quantum mechanics were false, then the laws would be different. Okay, so that's a counter legal, as we say. So first point, yes, that's a problem for my view, which is anchored in the world we live in with its chances, which are governed by the actual laws of quantum mechanics and so on. But let me also say, counter legals are trouble for everybody. You know, it's not just me that's going to have trouble with them. If quantum mechanics were false, I mean, we can say, well, you go to the closest world where quantum mechanics is false. I don't know what that even would be, to be honest. So it's not clear to me how one should evaluate that. But anyway, you have pressed on a good point that there are some counterfactuals. Notice you had to be pretty clever. You had to fashion the example to make it trouble for me. But yes, I can't easily answer that with my chance account. Your other example, if Hájek's view were wrong, then the similarity account would be true, something like that, I think it was. Actually, I'm not sure that's true even intuitively, because if my view were wrong, I would think some other view similar to mine maybe, but not Lewis's would then be the truth. But in any case, now I think you're not only talking about a counter legal, you're probably talking about a counter analytic. So if my view is true at all, I think it's analytically true. And so I'm now supposed to imagine something that's analytically true being false. And I think that's going to be trouble for lots of people, not just for me. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Let me select another question from Wenjie Hu. It's a clarificatory question. If we introduce probability in the counterfactual, for example, if a coin is tossed, it would have probability 0.5 to be heads. Is this true?
I think so. Now, you might say that maybe my own arguments undermine even that, but for now, I will say that that's true.
Okay, thank you. Let me scroll down the list. There's another question coming up from Guanlong Lu. Hájek seems to hold that counterfactuals are false is okay, because science can correct us. But if science is also full of counterfactuals, how could it correct our falsehoods?
That's a nice point. Let me just write that down. Well, science is full of chances, and if we really paid attention to the chances, as I claim we should, that should determine our counterfactuals. Yeah, science appeals to counterfactuals, but I think lots of them, if the scientists are being careful, will be probabilistically qualified. And then this actually fits well with the previous question. In the previous question, remember, I was happy to say the counterfactual is true if you just qualify the consequent probabilistically. If the coin were tossed, it would land heads with probability 1/2. That was okay. So I'm completely happy with science saying things like that. You know, if I were to release the pen, it would fall with chance, and now the scientist calculates the chance. That's fine by me. Okay, it's the sort of more casual counterfactuals that I think are false. The ones that we use in everyday talk. I think science might be rather more careful, or it should be. If it isn't, then to that extent, it's speaking falsely as well.
Okay, thank you. Let's also field a question from another guest of the lecture, from Yudi Huang. Yudi asks, you argue that counterfactuals are hypothetical predictions, but there are tenseless counterfactuals, or even counterfactuals involving no spatiotemporal events. Consider, if I were you, I would be a professor. And how do you measure the chance of the antecedent and the consequent?
Good. Again, I confessed it was a little bit, disguised when I just sort of slipped in the typical counterfactuals, but I did that for a reason, because I worried about the timeless counterfactuals too. So you're good to put your finger on it. So I have to give a different account where there's no time of the antecedent. I'm not sure that your example quite does that though. If I were you, well, okay, for starts, if you believe in like Kripke and the necessity of such identity statements, this is an impossible antecedent. It couldn't have been me then being you. So that's a problem for everyone. This is an impossible antecedent, which comes out vacuously true for Lewis, for example, and that doesn't seem right either. But maybe another way of thinking of it is, if there was some sort of point earlier in history where, you know, this won't do justice to the biology, will it? But if somehow, you know, I know the sperm and egg that became me could have become you, contra Kripke, then you just go back to that earlier time and you make a prediction relative to that. Okay, so two parts to my answer. One is, I think that taken literally, it's an impossible antecedent, and so it's trouble for everybody. And then with a bit of, you know, imaginary biology, I can even tell my story of going back to an earlier time where our identities could have gone one way or another. But you've pressed on a good point, that I don't have a theory I'm perfectly happy with for the tenseless, timeless antecedents. And that's why I kept on inserting that word typical.
Thank you, Alan. Let's maybe have one question from one of our panelists, Arthur Schipper. Arthur, why don't you just ask your question in person?
Okay, thank you. Yes. So I've got a couple of big picture questions, I guess, but maybe I'll just ask one of them. But the first one is, I do think some of the points that you made about science and everyday talk, that falsity is widespread. I think that seems plausible. But in the case of philosophy, it does seem like, especially in the case of philosophy and counterfactual, it does seem like philosophers use the notion of counterfactuals a lot to give account of things like the nature of knowledge, so safety and sensitivity conditions that express, that kind of try to capture virtues of knowledge and belief, for instance, robustness. These seem to rely, these are cashed out and accounted for in terms of counterfactuals.
Yep.
So I guess my first question is, what do you think the consequence of your argument that counterfactuals are mostly false would be for lots of philosophical accounts, for instance, of the nature of knowledge that uses robustness?
Well, I have a lot to say about that, and I've written a lot about that very question. Thank you. Okay, so first possibilities is that some of these analyses are just wrong. You know, they analyze knowledge in terms of blah, blah, blah counterfactuals, or causation in terms of blah, blah, blah counterfactuals. And the analyses are just wrong. So it's not that we have to panic that, you know, that there's no causation in the world or no knowledge because these counterfactuals are false. Rather, it's just the analysis in each case that's false. And by the way, we knew that anyway, because this is what philosophers are so good at doing, showing that these analyses are wrong. Like, for example, the Lewisian counterfactual analysis of causation, or the Nozick counterfactual analysis of knowledge. They're in so much trouble anyway that this is just icing on the cake. But that's the first thing. Second thing, I have remember I've said a few times now that some counterfactuals are true if they're appropriately qualified. So the correct analysis of these things may even appeal to counterfactuals, but you just got to do the qualifying. Like maybe it's a would probably. In the case of causation, I think that's clearly true, actually. I think that's the qualification you wanted. You wanted to probabilify the counterfactuals. And so I don't think that we should be a skeptic about causation or knowledge or personal identity or all of the other things that we analyze in terms of counterfactuals. I think either the analyses were wrong or they're on the right track, but you needed to use the correct counterfactuals, which may well be true. So that's my answer.
Julius,
thank you. Yeah. Well, thank you again for the talk. I think officially we're out of time.